But I prefer, instead of thinking of like, is it cheating or not? What's the developmental stress? What's it going to do for you? Touch and go deadlifts, utilizing the rebound, just like we do in squatting, it can be a very, very productive training stimulus. Guys, I've been doing a lot of reps lately, and I mean a lot of reps. And in doing all of these reps, I started to think about the way that we approach reps in working sets and the different implications that has for how we grow. We all run through these programs that give recommendations for the amount of weight that we're using by prescribing RPE or percentages. There's a list of exercises, there's a split and arrangement throughout the week, but it always bothered me that they never usually get into exactly how you should approach the reps, what the parameters are. And that can make a really big difference. Now, the obvious examples are in like squatting and deadlifting, where if you move really quickly, you fatigue much, much faster. Also, if you have to start from a dead stop as opposed to doing a touch and go or a bounce rep, that wildly changes what you can get away with in a set. So I want to cover some of the differences in these approaches and explain why all reps are not created equal. Real quick, guys, I just want to ask you to do me a favor and hit the subscribe button if you found any of this helpful, educational, entertaining. The growth of this channel is 100% from your support, and I appreciate it immensely. Now, a big mistake that people are going to make, and I was guilty of this when I was newer, is obsessing over optimization and what is best, as if such a thing exists in this space. It doesn't. There is no optimization. It all depends on what you are used to and what your goal is. What are you trying to get done next? So instead of worrying about what is best as if any one of these arrangements is going to somehow be better, you want to understand why they're different and how you should implement them to get a result and to fix weak areas to keep you well-rounded. So I want you to consider three main things that are going to be changed depending on how you approach your reps. You can have mechanical tension increase or decrease. That's essentially saying, is the muscle fibers, are they under tension? Is that how the load is being supported, and is that how it's being moved? For mechanical tension to be high, the movement has to be deliberate. The weight has to be moved under control, because if there's a lot of momentum, then that amount of tension decreases and the momentum assists in moving the weight. Another one is force production or strength-specific adaptations. When you're trying to train force, it's implied that you're prioritizing your nervous system, you're trying to move with more speed, more aggression, you're trying to recruit more motor units all at once. And that type of training tends to develop fast twitch fibers, which are also very important for strength-related activities, explosive-related activities. There's kind of an inverse relationship here, because as you start to focus more on speed and power and aggression, the amount of tension you can experience goes down, because faster movements have momentum on them. Training with more aggression fatigues you faster, so time under tension is lower. And this is all related to fatigue. And you can look at fatigue a few different ways. It could be a substrate deficit, which is the annoying way of saying you just ran out of fuel. It can be an accumulation of waste product. So you get all those hydrogen ions building up, which causes that sick burn in your quads and a high rep set of squats. It can be an accumulation of waste product. So when too much waste product builds up, it limits the ability of muscle fibers to continue contracting, and it's also really painful. So as you are able to buffer those out better, you're able to go longer. So that's one of the adaptations you look forward to when you train to fatigue very regularly. And then there's proximity to failure. Proximity to failure can come up a few different ways. It can be a byproduct of waste product building up and you're just gassed out. Failure could be just the inability of your nervous system to recruit enough motor units to get the job done. So all along the spectrum of high and low reps, you have a few different things you can look at. Now, all of these are related, and how you approach all of these variables is going to determine what you get out of the movement. Now let's consider for a second the entire cycle of a repetition. And this is going to apply to any barbell compound movement, benching, squatting, deadlifting. At the bottom of the movement, you have a lot of artificial tension created, a lot of mechanical compression from the muscles being stretched to their limit, from joints running into each other. So you get a lot of compression at the bottom. Now you have two options. You can either approach that with a deliberate, controlled change of direction, or with a very fast, explosive change of direction that utilizes stretch reflex. For those of you who aren't familiar, stretch reflex is essentially a trick of your nervous system. If you consider that a muscle is much, much stronger isometrically than it is concentrically, the body does this trick where on the way down, these muscles will freeze. And because they're so strong isometrically, they can turn themselves into makeshift trampolines where they basically absorb, store, and then repel kinetic energy. So when you get a really aggressive bench that bounces off your chest, when you see people just slam into the hole on a squat, or when you see people clipping off a bunch of bounce, touch and go deadlift reps, that's exactly what they're doing. And that provides a ton of assistance off the bottom end. Human beings have this trick for a reason. It's because it allows us to jump higher and to run faster. We are much stronger if we utilize stretch reflex. But the counter to that is it takes something away developmentally. You can become dependent on it.
Guys, I know from my analytics that if you're watching this, there's a 57% chance that you or your loved one is a bald weightlifter. So that's why I'm here with the Skull Shaver Pitbull Gold. My wife got this for me for my birthday. Like any good spouse, she got me something that was just as much for her as it was for me. She got tired of me letting my hair grow out because shaving my head was such a pain. This thing is super easy. Hit the power button. It comes fully charged. It gives a razor close shave to your head. So that was completely dry, no shaving cream, there's no razor bumps, and my head is smooth to the touch. So if this Christmas you or your loved one can benefit from a faster, easier, quicker way to get that smooth as silk head shaven look, then check out the Pitbull from Skull Shaver. It'll change your life. Click on the link below and they'll get you taken care of.
So then halfway up, you have this midpoint, which represents a stick point for a lot of people. And that's where you see this point of turnover. At the bottom, you have one muscle group that was primarily responsible for getting the weight moving. And then at this point of turnover, that kind of changes guard. And you have these other muscle groups that have to come in to finish off the movement. So how clean that turnover is going to determine how nasty of a stick point that is for you. Now, the thing about the midpoint is that in almost all of the reps you do, there is momentum on the bar at that point. If you consider every good rep you've ever done of a squat, bench, or deadlift, the midpoint of the lift, the bar is always in motion. You got a big start to get the lift going. And there's always that momentum, which reduces mechanical tension. And this is one of the things that can cause these stick points to persist and get worse over time. Because if all of your good reps have speed at that point of the movement, then those muscles are never under tension, meaning they're never being disadvantaged as much as they could be. They're never being trained as much as they could be. So you're not actually strong at that midpoint. Your performance is reliant on the momentum you build at the beginning. And the same thing goes for your lockout. Now, we're all familiar with top end strength. As you get to the top, there's a specific group of muscles that are usually responsible for nailing that lockout. And again, if all of your reps through a full range of motion have speed on them, then you're always locking out in the context of speed, which can be a problem if you get in a position where you're grinding or you're slowing down and you have to be able to rely on your strength at that range of motion to get through the lift. So consider a fast bench press. You're gonna get that stretch reflex off the bottom when everything's pulled tight. You're gonna utilize that artificial tension to get the weight moving. Then you're gonna have speed halfway up, and then you're gonna have speed at lockout, and all of your reps are going to go off like that. And you might be thinking to yourself, what an awful way to train. You're never gonna build size like that, which is of course ridiculous. A lot of people have built size using explosive techniques, even techniques that you might look at and think that's not good bodybuilding, that's not good weight training practice. The fact is, if you are loading your body with an external load and you are working very, very hard, your body will grow muscle as an adaptive response. Now let's look at what we get from this. What we get from this is a conditioning of speed. So that can actually be very helpful for explosive athletes, especially lower body movements, squatting, deadlifting. If you need quick hips, quick knees, you want to be able to move explosively. So working through these ballistic repetitions can be an asset to help you with force production to carry over to your chosen sport. Because you are moving fast, you're always pushing as hard as possible, so you're going to end up recruiting more motor units. Those motor units are going to get stimulated to grow, and the cycle repeats. And also the big one, you build up a lot of fatigue in a very short period of time. Going very, very hard out of the gate gets you to that point of fatigue much, much faster, much more aggressively, and that also represents a trigger for growth. Now, on the other hand, if we start moving slow, if we have a slower start, well, now we're not relying on the compression and on the stretch reflex to get the weight moving. In that situation, our nervous system has to be good enough to go from 0 to 60 like that. So training from a dead stop or with a deliberate start will immensely improve your starting strength. Where if all you're doing is rebounded reps, exploiting stretch reflex, you're gonna get very dependent on that. You might still grow, you might still get stronger, but you'll find you're very dependent on that for your performance. That's most obvious with deadlifts. If you know anybody who is a touch and go specialist, they bounce all their reps, they might put up some impressive performances, but when it comes to pulling that 1 rep max when it's glued to the ground, so I'm very much like that with like deadlifts. Like I can bounce through a bunch of reps. 725 is my all-time 1 rep max. I've also done it for a set of 5, bouncing each rep. If I had to go dead stop, that'd be a very different story. So slower, deliberate starts build starting power. It also makes sure that you're going to have tension at the midpoint. So around the stick point, you're going to temper yourself to being under that load, and those fibers and your nervous system actually will start to pattern better. They'll start to be more efficient, they'll come online sooner, and you'll have more strength. You'll have more point of purchase at that point where maybe historically you didn't. I can also think of this like deadlifters that have to use their legs a lot. I remember Chad Smith saying he's actually better in a deficit deadlift because he was such a big squatter, so he could squat way down, get a big leg drive, than he was at like a 16-inch deadlift, which you would think you'd be able to pull a lot more because you're mechanically advantaged and the range of motion is less. That is purely 100% a byproduct of training specificity. If he spent the time on elevated deadlifts that he did on squatting, he would be much, much stronger. But you have to train at that range. You have to do work at that range to optimize strength at that range, because if there's only ever momentum at that point, you're going to be limited by that. You're going to become reliant on that in order to perform. And the same thing near lockout. Slow, deliberate lockouts condition you to have that point of purchase as you get closer to lockout. So these are the big variables we can look at with regards to how you can modify reps. Rest in between reps is a big one. Now I've been thinking about that a lot because I've been doing this insane squat challenge. I've been gearing up for this 100 repper that I'm trying to scratch off my bucket list. So I'm trying to temper myself to getting way into the weeds. Now to pull off something like 100 reps, I have to keep a set tempo. It's like jogging. You can't go hard in the beginning because you'll gas out, and at the halfway point, you'll just be on your back turning purple. So I have to keep like a metronome, a set pace to pace myself through the entire thing. That's very different than if I do a bunch of pulse reps where I don't lock out and I'm moving each rep from one into the next. So low rest in between reps where you're just going boom, 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 boom down the line, local fatigue gets extremely high. Most of you, if you squat and deadlift, are probably used to taking a couple seconds in between reps to psych up and get your breath. If you ever do a working set, especially like medium to high reps, and you cut that rest down and you go as quick as you can, you are going to be blown away by how much it burns, how quickly it burns. It's going to feel like a completely different thing, and that'll show the value of doing something like that, especially if you're trying to target a particular muscle group, if you're trying to build up a lot of fatigue in one particular muscle group. Now, if rest is high in between, that means you can keep load high. So squatting, we exploit this all the time. You can recover at the top of a squat. You can't really recover at the top of a bench press. You just fatigue more. So at the top of a squat, you can get your breath, and it seems like you can always do one more. And some programs have exploited that. Super squats is a great example. You do breathing squats. It sucks, but it increases the general training stress to the point where you actually get a lot bigger and a lot stronger. So I generally think is shorter period of rest in between each repetition as being more bodybuilding oriented. That's what you're going to want to do when you want a particular muscle to just fry as quickly as possible. And high rest in between is where you're really trying to prioritize load. So it's going to be more about performance, usually whole body strength. You're exploiting that so that the ratio of weight used to work done can be very, very high. With speed, I mean, we talked about this not that long ago with the super slow tempo, train to failure, high intensity nut jobs that insist that using very, very light percentages with a very, very slow tempo to failure is all you need to do. And that's the, not just effective, but that's the best way to build muscle and strength in any capacity. Now, here's the deal. They are addressing a problem by having you move slow. And that is that, yes, you are getting muscle stimulation at every single step of the movement. There is value in that, but there's not so much value in that that it's worth completely ditching the benefit you get by focusing on force production and increasing load. So when the speed is low, we have a lot of tension, but the load has to stay very light. And inversely, when we're moving very, very fast and aggressively, tension isn't going to be quite as high. There's an inverse relationship there. Change of direction, we talked about this. That's a big one. Are you rebounding or are you going from a dead stop? The dead stop, are you moving very gently? Are you doing something like a spotto where you're controlling without even touching your chest? Are you using something like a heave on your bench or a jerk at the bottom of your deadlift to get it going? That all has different implications for the training stress and what it's going to make you better at. Generally, the more controlled, delicate, gentle the change of direction is, the nastier it's going to be as a training stimulus to get you strong at that point. That's why I like spotto bench presses. That's why I like RDLs, because I can get within an inch of the ground and change direction very, very delicately. And it makes pulling off the floor from a dead stop an absolute breeze. Now, most people might be inclined to just shit on touch and go specialists who bounce their way through all their reps. Funny aside, I remember 10, 12 years ago, Derek Poundstone posted a video on a forum of him deadlifting 800 for 9 reps. And of course, he was in a suit. He hitched most of them, and they were all touch and go. They were all bounce reps. And I remember this guy who was a pro middleweight ended up saying, I count 1 rep and 8 bounces. And I thought it was the funniest thing because in that forum, Derek Poundstone was like God. Nobody wanted to question him. You know, nobody wanted to push back. And he was just very blunt. Like those weren't, that wasn't a set of deadlifts. You did a bunch of bounce reps. So it's easy to look at that and think, obviously, if you're pulling 90% of your max for a set of 9, something's amiss. And if you have to go from a dead stop, if you standardize it a little bit more, you're not going to get that. But I prefer, instead of thinking of like, is it cheating or not? What's the developmental stress? What's it going to do for you? Touch and go deadlifts, utilizing the rebound, just like we do in squatting, it can be a very, very productive training stimulus because you're getting assistance at the bottom, which means most of the stress is going to be at the top end, at the lockout. So if you're not used to doing touch and go deadlifts, if you're used to every rep being from a dead stop, if you're used to a couple seconds in between each rep as you set up, if you switch to touch and go, all of a sudden the amount of rest in between each rep shortens immensely, and you're putting all this stress on your top end. So usually it's a really good way to get a burn in your ass. If you're having trouble getting your glutes online, do some touch and go deadlifts for like 10 to 15 reps. If you push any one of those sets, I promise you it's gonna feel like somebody's holding a blowtorch to your butt. Range of motion is another one that people like to bicker on. There are examples of people going through really wide ranges of motion and very limited ranges of motion. With limited range of motion, it's gonna be like limited rest. Local fatigue is going to be very, very high. This is one of the reasons that bodybuilders do it. If you're trying to torch your quads, your biceps, your triceps, keeping that tension on the muscle and not letting it rest, stopping short of lockout, stopping short of full extension, that leads to this surge of waste product that builds up. It gets you to fatigue very, very fast, and it's a substantial amount of fatigue. So that's very beneficial. Now, long ranges of motion work very well developmentally, but if you are working to fatigue, what you'll find is that longer ranges of motion, usually something else breaks down, something else becomes the limiting factor before the actual structure that you're trying to target. For instance, I know when working my triceps, if I'm going through a really long range of motion, my tricep extension will fail before I really feel like my tricep is that fatigued. It usually has to do with instability in my shoulder. What I experience is that the weight just stops and that's it. And I feel like I got a little bit of a stimulus, but not that much. Whereas if I do something like a rope press down and I limit the range of motion and I focus on pumping blood in like I'm pumping air into a bicycle tire, they just absolutely cook. They're immensely sore, and it just feels like a more productive training stress for what I'm trying to do with that particular muscle group. Similarly, if you've ever done things like 21s, you can do it for your biceps, but you can also do it for your delts. You can do it for things like squats if you're a masochist. Changing the range of motion will immensely change the rate at which you fatigue and how your body experiences this tension. And I want to take this opportunity to say you shouldn't be trying to do all of these all at once. If you are a reasonably well-rounded lifter, if you're doing a variety of exercises, and if you're experimenting with different things, especially in the accessory isolation department on the back end of your workout, you should be kind of organically checking a lot of these boxes. But don't stress, the point here is not to check off all of these. The point is just to understand how they're different so that you can use them to solve problems. And then lastly, time under tension. This is another one that was a big point of contention from the high intensity crew, is that moving very, very slow and moving to failure creates the highest amount of time under tension. And time under tension, while it's important, it's not so important that it trumps things like training volume or the amount of load that you're using. Like the weight you are under tension with is pretty relevant. If not, we would all just be cyclists. That'd be the easiest way to grow big legs. But it turns out that you have to get under a load, you have to expose yourself to some weight, and that actually helps you get stronger, which helps you use more volume, which helps you get bigger in turn. That's also the reason I do like volume, is because time under tension doesn't only matter in that single set. You can add up time under tension over all these other sets. So you can look at, instead of going 40 or 50%, you can handle 70 to 80%, a heavier, more strength specific load, a more substantial load, and you can build up a ton of time under tension by breaking it up into different sets, which is exactly why volume work is used by just about every strength athlete in the world. So yeah, if you're gonna keep time under tension down, that means load's high, fatigue's gonna be high, you're gonna be going into the weeds. Whereas if you want time under tension to be very, very high, you're gonna have to keep the load way, way down. And it's just a different type of training stress. If you're gonna do something like that, and I don't think there's a reason you shouldn't, it just shouldn't be your primary exercise. Use that on your isolation stuff at the end, the single joint exercises. When you're already through your heavy lifting and you're just trying to toast yourself, that's when you can throw in the super slow stuff. So practical application, we can look at this a few different ways. The first is evaluating where you're weak in a particular lift. So if you acknowledge that you have a weak lockout or you're weak around the midpoint, you can evaluate how often you are training where you are at a dead stop or where you are under no momentum, where you're training to get that point of purchase on the movement. And you can apply that to your squats, your deadlifts, and your pressing. And it works the same across the board. It's really easy to fix this by just changing the way you approach your reps. So your first exercise might be your benching, and you approach that the way you're comfortable benching with your set tempo and amount of aggression. But then you might go to something like a spotto press, and maybe you change your grip to change the stimulus a little bit, and you decide to slow it down a little bit. Maybe now you're going to stop a little shy of your chest. Maybe now you're going to focus on moving cleanly and fluidly through the range of motion, controlling the eccentric, building up time stressed in that position so that your body can adapt and be strong around that point. Holding lockout, something as simple as holding the lockout for a moment. Again, not being in a rush to lock it out and get back down. That can improve the confidence with which you get your hips through on a deadlift. That can improve the speed at which you get your lockout on a squat. So that by itself is a very effective tactic. Now, if you're weak at the bottom, you're having trouble getting that deadlift started off the floor, you're having trouble getting out of the hole on a squat, then you want to spend more time in this position not utilizing stretch reflex. So we disadvantage ourselves to get a bigger training stimulus at that spot. So deficit work, it's a little hard to do on bench. Some people's shoulders can't handle it, but you can do things like using fat grips to get an extra like ½ inch of range of motion. You can bench with a flat back, get rid of the arch, you can put your legs up. That all makes it a lot harder to get the weight moving at the start, which means as you get better, it's going to translate over to your normal bench press. Similarly with a deadlift, things like deficit deadlifts, and again, RDLs. You're super disadvantaged at the bottom of an RDL. You're coming down slow and controlled. You're not even touching the ground, gently changing direction. That builds just immense starting power. As long as you're not one of these guys that's going like an inch below your kneecap and calling it good. You know, get that sucker close to the floor. So that's my presentation on training reps and the different ways that you can manipulate how you approach your reps and what you can expect to get as a training stimulus from it. If you think there's anything I missed, anything you want to add on, go ahead and leave it in the comments. Better yet, take it to Patreon. That's where I film my workouts and upload them daily with commentary so you can see how I apply these principles in real time. Especially I'm doing all this crazy high rep squatting work. I'm doing a lot of just low rest, pulsed reps, just into the weeds. My legs are so sore right now from doing that type of work. And I'm playing around a lot with how fast I'm moving, what the range of motion is. Am I going wide or narrow? Am I cutting depth? Am I bouncing out of the hole? And this variety is really doing a lot to insulate me to the amount of work that I'm preparing for. So it's really good. So go ahead and check that out. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Till next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.